Welcome to today's program. Could I ask if you'd please turn your cell phones and other electronic devices off? To introduce our speaker is Clinton School student Angela Jimenez Leon, MD, from Bogota, Colombia. Angela came to the Clinton School after earning her medical degree in Colombia, where she worked as a hospital physician and as a general practice physician with the Colombian Air Force. At the Clinton School, she's worked with UAMS on a community needs assessment for its 12th Street Health and Wellness Center. She returned to Colombia for her international public service project, working with young adults with type 1 diabetes. And now she's working with the Arkansas Department of Health on medical issues relating to the Latino population in our state. Please welcome Clinton School student, Dr. Angela Jimenez Leon.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Eben Alexander III, born December 11, 1953, is an American neurosurgeon and the author of the 2012 autobiographical book, Proof of Heaven, a neurosurgeon's journey into the afterlife, in which he asserts that his out-of-body experience and near-death experience while in a meningitis-induced coma in 2008 proves that consciousness is independent of the brain. His book has been on the New York Times bestsellers list for over a year. Alexander attended Phillips Exeter Academy in 1972, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 1975, and the Duke University School of Medicine in 1980. Alexander was an intern in general surgery at the Duke University Medical Center, a resident at Duke Newcastle General Hospital in the UK. He was also a research fellow at Brigham and Women's Hospital and Massachusetts General Hospital, and is certified by the American Board of Neurological Surgery and the American College of Surgeons. Ladies and gentlemen, I have the pleasure to introduce you Dr. Alexander.
Well, hello, welcome. Such a beautiful day out there. A little bit chillier than I expected for Little Rock, but that'll do. Want to see a show of hands here because I'm going to be a little bit short on time and I want to plan my remarks accordingly. How many out there have not read the book Proof of Heaven? You will not be graded on this. Okay, good. All right. Well, you might wonder a little bit about what all the hoopla and excitement is about because the book definitely struck a chord, and I see it more as a reminder to souls of something souls know deep down. I think the best way to kind of portray the background of why I think this has had such an impact and what it really means to this world is to show the story arc of what I've been through personally, because it is a very personal and heartfelt story. And to see that, you really need to see where I came from. I had grown up in a home in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. My father was very influential in my life. He was an academic neurosurgeon who trained other neurosurgeons. He was very scientific. So I grew up in a home with Scientific American, that monthly journal lying around, and I read it cover to cover as a kid. I've always known science is the pathway to truth. Now, my father was also very spiritual. He had grown up during the Depression, had been a combat surgeon in the Pacific in the Second World War, and his strong spiritual faith in an infinitely powerful God is what got him through a lot of that brutality and through much of his life. And of course, he knew that if he operated on a patient, that patient did well, that his part was very minor. He knew that God was working in healing much more powerfully than he ever could as a mortal human being. Now, of course, I grew up in the 60s and 70s fully believing in that power of science. And I will tell you now, I'm more of a scientist than I've ever been. But I also realize that the science that I worshiped, the conventional, what's called reductive materialism, that basically says if you reduce everything that exists down to electrons, protons, quarks, subatomic particles, then go up through the chemistry and the biology and build it all up from those fundamental elements, then you can understand everything about all existence. And I believed that, hook, line, and sinker until my coma. Turns out that right now, this week, is the 5-year anniversary for my time in coma. And I am most grateful for that journey. Of course, many people would hear that and say, well, we understand you're grateful because you came back. Well, no. I'm actually grateful for the journey, every bit of it. And in fact, that's what we're all doing. We are all on a journey of learning. And this is down here in soul school, as I put it, in this material realm. This is where we learn the lessons. But we do so voluntarily dumbed down to a certain little trickle of information. Now, of course, I never paid attention to near-death experiences before my coma because I was a reductive materialist scientist that fully believed that the brain creates consciousness. And in that thinking, the teaching of science was, well, our life is birth to death and nothing more. My coma showed me very clearly that that's wrong. The brain does not create consciousness. It's actually a reducing valve or filter that dumbs down pre-existing consciousness to the little trickle of the apparent here and now. And that was a tremendous part of the revelation, and people often ask me about that title of the book, Proof of Heaven. And what I would say is it's very strong proof because of the fact that I had a severe, very rare, gram-negative bacterial meningitis, which is a most perfect model for human death. The problem is it usually results in human death. So not many people come back to tell the tale. To this day, my doctors cannot explain how I had such a complete recovery. Because when I did enter that emergency room, November 10th, 2008, I was already deep in coma. I was having seizures that were unbreakable. It had all started that morning with severe back pain and headache, but then I lapsed into unconsciousness within 3 hours or so. And of course, my doctors knew that meningitis might be the culprit, and they also knew that if you have a gram-negative bacterial meningitis and you go into coma in anything less than 24 hours, and I only took 3.5 hours to get into coma, they know that you're already down to a 10% chance of surviving that illness. They put me on 3 very powerful antibiotics, which did not seem to be working, and that was a source of tremendous consternation to them, especially given, as I explained in the book, the history of my recent travel to Israel, where for me the most impressive thing was arriving there in Tel Aviv at 3 in the morning and then being taken to Old Jerusalem by a cab driver who didn't speak any language spoken by anyone else within about 2,000 miles. And he could not find my hotel, and he finally set me off in the pre-dawn darkness to wander my way to my hotel on my own, which I did, and stumbled on the Via Dolorosa. So that, of course, is what I remembered about the trip. Something that happened while I was there that my doctors knew about, and I had never known about at the time, is the fact that the worst case nightmare scenario for infectious disease specialists had occurred in a Tel Aviv hospital, where a gene that conferred absolute and complete antibiotic resistance on the host bacterium had come up in a fashion that was very frightening to them, had moved into a patient's E. coli. And in fact, they thought I had brought that back from my trip to Israel. Luckily, over time, over the week, they found that was not the same strain, but I was still not responding to antibiotics. And by day 7, which was a Sunday morning, we'd gotten to a point where there was really no sign left. My neocortical function had ended within an hour or two of getting to the emergency room. My brain stem badly damaged even on that first day. And by the end of that week, lightening all sedation and everything, there was nothing left to preserve. And so the recommendation was it was time to stop the antibiotics and let nature take its course. Because by then I was down to a 2% chance of survival, no chance of recovery. And of course, it was a few hours later that I started coming back to this world. And I promise you, my brain was so wrecked and savaged by this incredibly aggressive E. coli bacterial meningitis, that when I was first coming back to this world, I had absolutely no words, no language, no memories of my life as Eben Alexander before coma. In fact, I knew nothing of earthlings of this universe. But what I did know when I started coming back was an incredible journey I had been on, an odyssey that I describe a lot in The Proof of Heaven, a deep spiritual odyssey into a hyper-real realm, far beyond the reality of this realm, that included an earthworm eye view, a very primitive, subterranean, unresponsive environment that, in looking back on it, I think was the best consciousness my brain could muster soaking in pus, with the whole neocortex, the human part of the brain, being destroyed, as my scans and my neurologic exams and my lab values all revealed. And in fact, that earthworm eye view, if you'd asked me before my coma, what's the next step in the evolution of that awareness, I would have said nothing. You know, that's the last step before your brain and consciousness blinks out of existence. And I would have been dead wrong. Because in fact, what came next was a spinning white light, a perfect musical melody that opened up into a rich, idyllic valley. Beautiful butterflies, a beautiful girl on the butterfly wing, souls dancing below, angelic choirs above, joy and mirth beyond description. And then beyond that, those angelic choirs above, swooping orbs of golden light leaving sparkling trails against that blue-black sky, providing yet another musical, frequency, vibrational portal into higher and higher realms. That's why so much of my research today is work that I do with Sacred Acoustics, with Karen Newell, who's here in the audience. Karen Newell and Kevin Cossey of Sacred Acoustics are involved in coming up with sound meditations. I mentioned some of that towards the end of the book, of how sound has been used for thousands of years to enhance deep meditative journeys. For those out there who are interested, you can go to sacredacoustics.com to learn more. Go to my website, lifebeyonddeath.net, to learn more. Go to eternia.org, which is also listed in the book. But I found that it's all about consciousness. And in fact, when I first came back to this world, as I said, I had no language or anything. I remember this spectacular journey, not only into that gateway realm, that earth-like realm with the beautiful butterflies, millions of them, colors beyond description, reality that beyond any possible words. And then through those angelic choirs and hymns, seeing all of that world collapse down, and the concepts of space and time as we see them completely compactified from that point, and then higher into this deep realm, this what I call the core, infinite inky blackness, formless, timeless, absolutely filled to overflowing with the infinite love of that divine. A deity so far beyond any words or description that when I came back, those of you who read the book will realize, and I was trying to write all this up and explain it because my words did come back over hours, and my childhood memories did come back over weeks, and my knowledge of brain, mind, and consciousness did come back over about 8 weeks. And all that time I was very busy trying to record everything that I remembered from deep in coma. My older son, Eben IV, who was majoring in neuroscience at that time, and who had been with me for 4 days and nights while I was in coma, along with a lot of other family members who were there holding my hand 24/7, trying to give me an anchor to this world, who were hosting prayers in my ICU room. Of course, I remember none of that at all. Everything that happened on this earth while I was gone, I had to get from other people, from doctors, nurses, family, friends, to interpret it all. But what I came to find over that period of time, I was writing all this down, trying to explain it. But I was trying to explain it based on my old thinking. Because my doctors had told me, when I first came back and I tried to tell them these stories, they said, well, you cannot have experienced anything. We have no idea how you're even coming back to us now. In fact, most doctors who take care of such patients who are deep in coma for 7 days on a ventilator with gram-negative bacterial meningitis will tell you it's a downright miracle. I can put 2 or 3 words together, much less write a book about it and go around talking about the experience and about the deep mystery of consciousness and what it tells us about the nature of our existence. I can tell you, when I did write that manuscript, initially in those weeks trying to write it up as a brain-based phenomenon, that's what gives you those hypotheses that I list in the book. And there were more than that, but those were the main main hypotheses, 9 of them, trying to look at a way to explain this ultra-reality and this incredibly rich journey based in what we know now conventionally about the brain, the mind, the neocortex, and severe bacterial meningitis. And yet what is so powerful is working with colleagues, working with my doctors, going through my medical records in detail, trying to explain it as some hallucination, some dream, some drug effect. At the end of the day, we were absolutely unable to do that. The evidence was so strong in that meningitis, in my particular case, and in my history and my exams, that in fact there was no place in my brain for that rich spiritual experience, which to me seemed to last for months or years, although it had to happen within 7 Earth days. There was no way to explain it as a brain-based mechanism. And of course, the deeper reality of that hit me very hard about 4 months after my coma. And that's kind of the punchline of the book, which I will not go into now. But it has everything to do with understanding that each and every one of us are eternal spiritual beings. That in fact, when our physical brain and body die, our conscious awareness is elevated to a much higher level. And of course, this is what near-death experiences by the tens of thousands have been trying to tell us for decades. But the medical community, myself included before my coma, would have been out there saying, well, no, it's got to be some trick of the dying brain, pay it no mind. We know that brain creates consciousness. Well, truth of the matter is, I knew nothing about what's called the hard problem of consciousness, which I now know is the deepest mystery known to all of human thinking. And put simply, the hard problem simply says that no one on earth who studies brain, mind, and consciousness, and the mind-body debate has been going on for more than 2,600 years. You'd think we'd be getting closer to having some understanding of an answer. But in fact, the decade of the brain did not offer up several thick volumes explaining how the physical brain creates consciousness. In fact, I would say the decade of the brain and all the recent brain research has gotten us closer and closer to realizing that consciousness is not created by the brain at all. And the hard problem is the simplest way of putting that nobody on earth can give you that first sentence to explain anything about how the physical brain gives rise to consciousness. As a neurosurgeon, I can tell you that there's this implicit assumption out there that there's something about the complexity of having 13 billion neurons firing away in this 3-pound gelatinous mass that somehow, because of that complexity, gives us this illusion of consciousness. And what I've come to realize is that pure materialist scientific view that I held before my coma that says the brain creates consciousness, birth to death, nothing more, that's absolutely false, because in fact consciousness is a far deeper mystery than that. And consciousness is the thing that exists. In fact, consciousness, all of our consciousness, not just humans but of all life, and not just life on earth, converges into one consciousness. And in fact, that has so much to do with understanding how all of this works and what the reason is that we even exist in these bodies. And what I came to realize is that material realm, you know, of all those subatomic particles and the chemistry and biology and the brain and that illusion of consciousness that I would have said is out there before, as much as I wanted to believe in God and an afterlife and that kind of thing, all those years in neurosurgery, I found it more and more difficult to explain how consciousness could survive the death of the body and the brain. And I now know that that actually is much simpler to realize how that works when you realize that consciousness is the thing at the core of it all anyway. And at the deepest levels, our consciousness is with the divine. So that God, that infinitely powerful healing source, that in my coma, when I came back, I was so awed by the experience of that deity that I did not even use the word God. Because for me, the word God was a puny little human word. And it brought up these images, you know, from my Sunday school and from my earlier years that had nothing to do with the power and awe and the infinite, unconditional love of that Creator for the creation and for all beings in that creation. And that's right at the core of each and every one of our consciousness. That's why you don't have to die or almost die to get this, just by being a conscious being. But that's why I work with sacred acoustics, developing the tools, meditation techniques to get people into very deep transcendental states. Because you can go to all the talks and read the books and watch the DVDs. You can do that till the cows come home. But at the end of the day, if you want to know these truths, You have to go there yourself. It's within our consciousness. That's why deep meditation, centering prayer, for many the gift of desperation. I'm sure there are many in this room who know exactly what I'm talking about there, but this is often how we're given those events, those gifts that transform us forever. And I came to see as a healer, as a doctor, the power of understanding how prayer can work, how our mental state, our mind has tremendous power over our reality. And of course that includes our health. And I came to see that we are all not only physical, mental, and emotional beings, but more so we are eternal spiritual beings. We are eternal spirit, and we all have divinity at our core. And that divinity comes with infinite healing power of love that has no conditions attached to it. And of course, that's an ancient lesson that's been around for thousands of years. And in fact, it's at the core of all the great religious traditions, is that infinite love of the Creator, and that the love that we share as beings blessed with existence in this world. And so for me, that is a tremendous part of the gifts. And of course, I heard all this spoken, not as words, but as pure concepts when I first encountered that beautiful companion on the butterfly wing. And those who've read the book will realize she was a tremendous key, a gift to helping me understand the reality of my journey because of the nature of how she was there, and it was impossible to explain her presence other than knowing the deepest truths of our eternal spiritual beings and the divinity that we all share. And so I think going forward, the best part about proof of heaven and what it brings to this world is a way to see that the stale old dogma of some of our scientific and religious teaching, for example, that you're either spiritual or scientific. Well, actually, I'm more scientific now than ever, and that's because I realize science must broaden its boundaries tremendously and admit this deep mystery of consciousness and the fact that our souls are eternal. And it has everything to do with understanding how healing really works and the purpose for our being here. And much of that does involve the fact that the eternity of our souls, and the fact that I deeply needed to explain how an infinitely loving God, infinitely powerful God, would allow for all of the suffering of innocents like children and animals, the transgressions on this world. There's far more suffering and pain than one could imagine with an infinitely loving God. How could that God allow all this to happen? And I saw in my journey that a huge part of that understanding has to do with the fact that eternity of soul also implies that we are reincarnated, that we come back. And of course, I'd never read the scientific literature on past life memories in children and on transpersonal psychology, so because I thought brain creates consciousness, so none of that could be real. I now realize the scientific literature on it is very strong. Of course, there's several references for that in my book. And it also explains so much. To realize that often if we lose a child, that child is a very advanced soul. Here, teaching loved ones and soulmates deep lessons about the nature of our eternal existence, connectedness of our souls with each other, and that in fact we are all divine creatures that are infinitely loved by the most powerful source in the universe. So it comes to a whole new understanding of how this all works. And I'd say it's only really bad news for those who are so close to a theory of everything in that simplistic kindergarten level of materialist scientific thinking, who were so hopeful in this world to publish or perish, as I used to say at Harvard, publish and perish, but so used to thinking that they're close to a theory of everything. Well, I'll promise you from my journey, human brain and mind will never, ever understand fully the workings of that divine. And in fact, we'll never weigh in pro or con the existence of that realm, other than to point out that the hard problem of consciousness is a deeply vexing mystery, and that should be a clue to all of us that something much deeper and more mysterious is going on here. The material world is not all there is at all. In fact, it all is supervenient. It rises from that realm of infinite divine consciousness, soul, and spirit. And so I think with that, what I'd like to do is thank you once again very much for being here today. It's a real honor to be standing here before you and sharing this, and we'll open it up maybe 10 minutes of questions. So thank you very much. God bless you all.
Thank you, Dr. Alexander.
Thank you so much.
If you'll raise your hands and then wait for the microphone because we'll need to hear the microphone. Let's see. We have a question right here.
I have read your book, and I have a question if you've had any more communication with...
Yes. The answer is yes. And that is, in fact, as I was trying to uncover this and began to appreciate what had happened and what it meant, of course, I saw that consciousness is the key. And in point of fact, it turns out that the only thing any one of us truly knows exists is our consciousness. The rest of it is really kind of a bit up in the air, but that's the one thing that we know truly exists. And of course, let's realize that modern neuroscience would tell you that everything that's ever happened in your experience that you remember as your experience in this world before the time you were born is basically the firing of those 13 billion neurons in a 3-pound gelatinous mass floating in a warm, dark bath. It's a model. Don't take it overly seriously. And so I realized consciousness was the key to an understanding. I mentioned a bit during my talk about how God was way too puny a word. And so I used the word Om because Om was the sound that I heard in that realm, especially in the core. Infinite inky blackness filled to overflowing with the love of the divine and a creator that is beyond any words or description, and that brilliant orb of light. And so for me, meditation became a way to go back in there and get, not just to get access to those memories, but to re-enter that world, that realm, that oneness with that God. And when I talk about meditation, and of course the sound meditations from sacred acoustics, for me that is a form of centering prayer that has an infinitely loving God at the core of it all. And yes, I've encountered my guardian angels and other guides in that realm very well. And that's important to understand. The voice in our head is not our consciousness. And of course, I didn't know that before. I thought that voice in our head is consciousness, and that's a very misleading concept. It's the observer of that voice that is consciousness, and that's what we can access much more richly in deep meditation. So whenever I go into meditation, I try to do that 2 or 3 hours a day. It's all about letting that little voice in my head offer up a request, state an intention, offer some gratitude, because for the last 5 years I've been nothing but gratitude. But then that little voice goes into timeout because there's much greater wisdom in those deep meditative states.
I had a question right here in the front row. Yes, right here.
I have a girlfriend here that lost a child 2 years ago, a very young child, and she actually has been able to connect with her through the cosmic mind. And I brought her here today so that she can hear someone else that has actually had. I've had a near-death experience. Some of us here have. Mm-hmm. There's also a book called the Urantia book.
Yes.
Are you familiar with it?
Yes, I am familiar with that.
Okay.
I'm working my way through it.
Well, yes, it is a work in progress, but it is the blend of science and spirituality. But I am...
Well, that's very true. I think one of the biggest gifts that Proof of Heaven can bring to this world, and that so many others can, Proof of Heaven is a way of taking the lid off. It's only one little story. There are millions of stories out there, and a lot of them have to do with communication with our departed loved ones. And it's absolutely real. I cannot stress how much that is absolutely real. It's not some little figment of the imagination, some little make-believe, because often we get clues from those communications with those who are passed over that are critical in the moment, then and there, about helping us with our own health and our own knowing about our lives. They prove to us they're actively involved. This is not just some memory. And that's why a lot of my work now, I'm being asked to talk at medical schools, nursing schools, surgical groups, physician groups around the country. And of course, I'll put it out there, yes, the nurses have always gotten this. They've always known the truth that's there in Proof of Heaven. They don't need any proof because ICU nurses, hospice nurses, ER nurses, they've seen so much. They've been right there on the front lines when patients make that transition, and they realize when a physical body dies, it is not the end. And in fact, what I'd like to see is changing up hospice in this country, following the model of birthing centers, showing it's a celebration, it's an awakening, it's an adventure, making that transition to a much higher consciousness. There's no question in my mind. There are millions of stories out there that confirm this, and that show that that little materialist model, brain creates consciousness, is woefully inadequate. And so thank God for other people who will share their story, and there are millions out there. And that's also why we started eternia.org, ETERNEA.org, which is listed at the end of the book. And it's all about letting millions share their own spiritually transformative experiences, not just near-death experiences, but all the many forms, including after-death communications, deathbed visions, past life memories in children. I mean, there is so much evidence out there. It's absolutely overwhelming. And it's time for our scientific community to wake up to that. A lot of scientists do get this. So, I mean, I can speak for myself. I was a little slow on the uptake. I needed a big thumping. Okay. So finally, I'm starting to get it. But thank God for other people who share their stories, because it's absolutely real. When the physical body dies, it's not the end.
There's a question right here in the back, the very back. Yes, ma'am. Just go ahead and stand up and they'll get you a microphone. Wait a minute. Wait for the mic, please.
You want a mic?
I haven't read your book yet, but I was wondering if in your experience that you saw any animals, and also my curiosity leads me to ask the question, do they have the ability to speak in heaven? Are they there?
Well, I'll put it this way. There is no speaking. You know, I make the point that there was never words in my journey. There was pure conceptual understanding. Yes, of course animals are there, and it's an important thing to understand. Again, it gets back to what I said a few minutes ago. The little voice in our head, you know, that is not your consciousness at all. There's the observing mind in you that witnesses that. Animals can actually have a much richer spiritual existence because they're not bogged down by the little, you know, rational voice in the head. They're very telepathic. I think anybody in here who owns a dog knows that. Horses, I mean, incredibly telepathic, and they have very rich spiritual existence too. So yes, they're there, but none of it is about speaking English, you know. Tower of Babel has no meaning there because all understanding is complete. It's not through this linguistic bottleneck. And that, of course, is something that so many who have had near-death experiences and other spiritually transformative experiences talk about.
We have time for one more question. Yes, sir, back there at the back. Yes, sir, raise this.
Carl Jung talked about the collective unconscious. How would you relate your experience to that concept?
Well, I think that Jung was very much right on the target. In fact, you know, the question is how do we access that information? I've seen plenty of evidence that there are those of us who can come completely up out of space and time in their understanding and knowing of things. And whether they're accessing what are called the Akashic records or the quantum hologram, as David Bohm and Carl Pribram put it, how is this information knowable? And I think to understand it, you need to understand that our ideas of space and time are just about ready for a complete overhaul because they're not correct. And those who pursue quantum mechanics and trying to get deeper into the mystery of quantum gravity and understand more deeply how the physics of this realm is put together, of course, it really gets back to the original mystery of quantum mechanics, which drove the founding fathers, very brilliant thinkers, into mysticism because it told them that consciousness is responsible for painting the unfolding reality. And I would say our current physics community has not really done a very good job over the last 100 years of trying to interpret what those experiments are truly saying. But it gets down to a deeper understanding of consciousness and what it is, and also space and time, because in fact past and future are not what they appear to be. And this is all something that you get into as you pursue deeper and deeper into the materialist science and physics and cosmology, trying to understand it all. I said a while ago that the brain does not create consciousness. In fact, it's a reducing valve or filter. That's an idea that came along in the time of Carl Jung, who I think was very into this, as well as William James, Frederick Meyer, people who were deeply into the psyche and the knowing of human consciousness and what it truly was. They saw plenty of evidence that aspects of personality survive bodily death, and they were the ones who were originally coming up with a filter theory or some kind of transceiver theory to explain how consciousness comes in. Some modern people will put it out there and say that the brain is kind of like the television set. So, you know, the program comes through, but don't think you're going to find the actors in the program inside the brain. The brain is simply the machinery that produces output from mind or consciousness. And I think we're just beginning to wake up to that in a scientific sense. Again, it's only bad news for those who thought they were tantalizingly close to a theory of everything, because we're not and never will be.
Let's give another round of applause to Dr. Eben Alexander.
Thank you. Thank you all very much, and God bless you